here's the final installment in our haiku writing exercise. So to this point, we've used 7 notes and an eighth in our bass. And we've played it with 3 different rhythms. The bass pulsing 4 times, and then 2, and then 1. In there, you also heard a point where I had a much longer pulse. I don't know if I've mentioned that yet, but that's something else to keep in mind as well. It doesn't have to be that you play a note for every 4. Sometimes what might sound really good is to create a lot of space and anticipation before the next note comes in. So doing 8 pulses, 12 pulses, whatever feels right. You can always experiment with that. It's a really powerful thing in music, is using space, and I think it actually takes some musical courage that you need to develop, because it's much easier to just keep nervously chattering with your instrument than it is to be simple and quiet at times. But like I said, it really builds the anticipation and makes things more exciting when they begin to happen. So the last things that we can do to experiment rhythmically with our picking hand on this, well, maybe not the last thing, but the last thing we'll deal with, is to, rather than play the notes in unison, play them separate from one another. This rhythm is much more busy than the other ones, and it's certainly a notable contrast to the first one we dealt with. But it also gets you into another important musical concept, which for a lot of us, I think, exists mostly on the subconscious level, but that is the experience of contrast in music, and it's something that I think draws both the listener and the player in, and keeps them interested in the song. We don't necessarily want to hear the same thing over and over. Sometimes we do if it's a really hypnotic groove, but at other times what we want to hear is things that get us feeling like we're going to be staying in the same musical dimension. But then adding these little moments of contrast, putting in that space, so that when we next play a little run of notes, it sounds even more interesting. So the last thing you could experiment with this is to try things with your fretting hand that we haven't really discussed yet. You could add a hammer-on in from time to time, a pull-off, a hammer-on pull-off. You could slide from one note to another. You could bend a note. You could add some vibrato to a note. Or you could try to pair some of these notes together and see what sort of sounds you come across. There's a lot of different possibilities. So if you've worked through everything with your picking hand and you feel really confident in those 4 rhythms, the next thing to do would be to experiment a little bit with your fretting hand and what that might do to add some interest to what you're playing. So now I will try to do one final haiku, and this one will try to use a little bit of all of these various ideas I've mentioned. hope that gives you all sorts of possibilities to play around with now. And as I mentioned in the first installment, if you come up with a haiku you really like, see if you can remember what it was you played, or just hit the record button and send me whatever you play. I would be very curious and interested to listen.